We can get going, I guess. Welcome to the breakout session. This is being recorded for all of those of you who are missing this session, who might want to see it later. Welcome in the distant future. This was organized by the practice committee. Trey Eubanks from Downard Children's Hospital in Memphis will be assisting for your questions, and this is to be a free-flowing discussion and primarily aimed at those of you who are either in fellowship or early in your careers who have an interest in potentially becoming involved in administration or issues outside the operating room. So to advance, I press this green button, or how do I advance? Good. The practice committee feels that American healthcare systems now are becoming complicated, confusing structures and have already become very complicated, confusing structures. People train at academic medical centers, they come out of medical school, and they often don't realize that there is this strange overlap between the hospital and the university. Some of the services run in parallel, some are combined. Being a member of the medical staff is dramatically different than being a member of your department in your academic institution, your medical school. And these may be new concepts that we feel, as the practice committee, may be taught very poorly in medical school and residency and fellowship. Surgeons typically are thrown into this after finishing their training and then learn on the job. There are now multiple people other than physicians involved in the coordination and delivery of health care. And in the old days, when half the membership of APSA was in private practice and had nothing to do with the hospital administration, the administrators were felt to be the enemy oftentimes, and it was us versus them. And the practice committee feels that that is not the case, that we need to work together and do what's right for children. However, we have the unique ability to help our administrators understand many of the clinical issues that affect children who are involved in surgery. We are the ones in the trenches at 3 a.m. with the baby with necrotizing enterocolitis with intestinal perforation. They're at home in bed, and we need to help work with them to help them understand these things. Most pediatric surgeons do more than just clinical care. As you may know, we did a practice committee survey 3 years ago of the APSA membership. We had pretty good response rates, and 87% of us had access to trainees, and a good 97 to 98% of us were involved in teaching every week, whether it be medical students, residents, fellows, nursing students, PA students, whatever. So it's clear that we do more than just operate on kids and go to the clinic. We're involved in teaching, we're involved in research, we're involved in helping the hospital or helping the healthcare system take care of the kids. So in order to improve the health of children, it's the opinion of the practice committee, chaired by John Bleacher, as well as I think there are 23 or 24 of us, that pediatric surgeons should dedicate a certain portion of their professional time to teaching and administrative works. And we thought we could convene a group of specialists to tell us what their journey was like, because they each have administrative roles in their institutions, how they got involved in this, how they are achieving what they are achieving. And then we're going to leave a lot of time at the end, a good 20 minutes, for interaction and questions and trying to grill down on these folks and get some take-home messages that you can use at your own institutions on how to be successful, to help kids, to help your hospital, to help your healthcare system, and even to help yourself as you continue your careers. These are 5 friends. They are each going to give a 6-minute talk. Kevin, got that? 6 minutes.
Yeah, I'll set my time.
They were specifically asked not to bring slides and not to give a lecture, but to give us some personal insights on what their transition was, their first non-clinical administrative duties, why they got interested in it at all, and was there some aha moment, either an interaction with an administrator or a patient or a parent, that was instrumental in kind of helping them do what they do. So the first speaker is Stephanie Chao. She's assistant professor of surgery at Stanford University up in Palo Alto. She's the program director of their chest wall program. She's also the trauma medical director at the Lucile Packard's Children's Hospital and the course director for the Division of Pediatric Surgery CME course. So she's going to speak with us on 6 minutes. And I guess, according to Dr. Bleacher, the formal title of your talk is Insights of an Early Career Surgeon for Starting the Journey into Administration. Thanks. You can come up.
Oh, okay.
I'll take your seat.
All right. Thank you for the introduction.
Got your watch, Trey? Okay.
Thank you to Dr. Bleacher for still calling me the young person and the early career person. That makes me feel good about myself. So I'm going to choose to talk about my role as a trauma director, which was probably the first administrative role that I took on. And it was very much a role that I fell into. So I actually was returning from maternity leave in my first to second year of being young faculty. And when I got back, I was told, surprise, you're the new trauma director. And I would say that that story is probably like 80% true. And it was also lesson number one, which is there's a job that no one wants to do, just assign it to the person who's not there. When I was a fellow, I actually had some exposure to this. We were going through our very first site visit as a level 1 trauma center when I was a senior fellow. And I helped our then trauma director kind of go through the process. So I learned a lot about it, not thinking that I would ever take on this role. But then as I joined as faculty, there were these very abstract discussions like, well, would this be something you might be interested in someday? And as a very junior person, I never said no. So I said, sure, yeah, maybe. And so then that's kind of how it came to be, that no one else really wanted to do it, and I wasn't there, and then I got voluntold to do it. But I really did have a choice, and when I thought about it, I thought, you know, a lot of my time leading up to being faculty was spent in public health. That was where my research was. My passion was at the time it was liver cancer awareness, of developing outreach programs and awareness programs on a very large public health scale. And when I came on as faculty at Stanford in pediatric surgery, what I had done for decades before, I was trying to merge the two paths. And I actually was struggling quite a bit in my first 2 years as faculty trying to make those two paths overlap because my clinical duties had nothing to do with what I had done really a lot of previous research on. And so I thought that maybe trauma would actually give me this opportunity to finally find a logical merging of these two things, which is my passion in trying to do public health, and in this case it would be injury prevention, and also having a kind of natural niche in pediatric surgery. It turns out when I was a second year medical student, I was scrubbing in with David Spain one day. David Spain was just stepped down as the president of the AAST. He just completed his term. And we were, I think, scrubbing into a hernia repair. And he randomly said, hey, Chao, you know you can save a lot more people, a lot of motorcyclists with helmets? And this just came out of nowhere. And I think in his mind, he thought, he knew I liked public health. Everyone knew I was this big public health advocate in liver cancer awareness. And what he was trying to show me was that there is another avenue of public health. And at the time I was this undifferentiated resident, he thought maybe he could guide me to trauma. I had no interest in trauma at the time, but, you know, fast forward 7, 8, 9 years, and those words actually stuck with me, so that when this opportunity came up, I actually recalled that conversation while we were scrubbing in. And that kind of leads me to one of the other points that Duncan wanted us to mention, which is mentors. And I think it's true for, well, a lot of what we do is not to have a single mentor, but a collection, a conglomerate of mentors that you draw from. And so David Spain is very well established as a national figure in trauma. He is the trauma director of the adult Stanford healthcare system. For someone young like me starting out trying to build a new level 1 pediatric trauma program, He's not the perfect person to go to for little details about which meetings are important, how to go set those up, and how to recruit them. But he was the guy to have in my corner. He was the guy who made national introductions for me. He was the guy to say, these are the things that are on the horizon. These are things we need to be prepared for. And most importantly, he was always the guy in my corner wanting me to succeed. I had other mentors who were not at all in trauma or pediatric surgery. And as I was starting out and trying to build the program, you know, oftentimes you get so mired in the weeds, thinking about this part not going right or what's the next thing. And the other mentors were really good at actually not being in this at all and reminding me not to sweat the small stuff so that I could keep my eye on the bigger vision and my bigger goals. And actually, the thing that turned out to be the best day-to-day mentors about how to do this job, which no one really gave me an introduction to, were actually the trauma program managers, the nurses. And they, you know, they had a lot of experience, both from our institution, other institutions. They really brought this wealth of knowledge. And I think there's often such a dynamic, kind of like a power dynamic between doctors and nurses that even though I try to make myself very approachable, I think they often just don't feel comfortable saying exactly what's on their mind. So I repeatedly asked them what they were thinking and how they used to do it and what worked and what didn't. And really that, I think, has been the strength of our program and why we've been able to grow it and continually develop it because we have a very good working relationship, because I went to them for help. And then I heard what they had to say, and then we implemented it together. So those are my collection of mentors. It's a continuing, growing process.
Great.
And I'm getting the hook.
Great. Get the hook. Thank you. Great. Thanks, Cynthia, Stephanie, for starting us off. And Stephanie is also going to comment later about how she got funding for her job, which I have specifically asked her to talk about. Since clearly, if you get an administrative duty as a young faculty member, it takes time away from being in the OR and getting those RVUs. And so we're going to get some insight on how to stay financially sound as you begin to take on administrative duties in your healthcare institution. And Stephanie is going to help us with that, and so is Cindy as well. So the next person who's going to speak is Cindy Downard, who is an endowed professor in pediatric surgery at the University of Louisville in Kentucky, director of the Division of Pediatric Surgery and Surgeon-in-Chief at the Norton Children's Hospital, as well as the program director of their Pediatric Surgery Fellowship. She's going to give us insights of a mid-career surgeon and a brand new surgeon-in-chief.
Thank you for Dr. Phillips for the invitation to speak. So as he said, I'm a mid-career surgeon, I hope. I'm 15 years out of fellowship. When I started in Louisville, which has been my only job, and I'm from Louisville, so I really wanted to have a basic science research presence. Part of the early discussion about being involved in hospital committees, I had no idea even existed. And so I started out on the Central Line Associated Bloodstream Infection Committee. I also had done a critical care fellowship during my training, and so was the surgical critical care director for our hospital. So was basically the person who got all of the complaints on both sides from the NICU, PICU, and from the surgical teams about each other, and tried to make everyone play nice in the sandbox. We also didn't really have a functional fetal board at the time, and so I worked with the maternal fetal medicine specialists, with the neonatal specialists, and with the surgeons to put that effort together, and that's gone through multiple iterations. And then I knew I wanted to be a program director in pediatric surgery. We had a brand new fellowship, so my mentor, Mary Fallett, whom most of you know, hopefully, has been instrumental in just helping me navigate those hospital relationships. But as I was on more and more committees and more interactions in the hospital, I learned that really being a surgeon-in-chief is an opportunity to cement those relationships and to try to move the whole process forward. And a couple of thoughts. I think the physician voice is just critical in the day-to-day function of a hospital. You look at different graphs as far as administrator pay over the last 20 years and how it's going up exponentially, and physician pay, you know, the evil physicians who are making all the money in the U.S. healthcare system, is flat to very minimally increasing. So having that physician voice, though, I think is just absolutely needs to be a part of the day-to-day function of a hospital. And as Dr. Phillips said, you as the surgeon especially can identify the processes, the staffing, the resources, and I literally wrote on my notes 3 o'clock in the morning. That's when everything goes down that's a problem, and the administrators, by and large, are not present at that time. But everything gets rehashed the next morning on the safety call. So the other thing that I think we do really well is keep optimal patient care at the center focus, and everything else sort of follows behind. So one example that is a very illustrative example of the physician voice being important, we have a group called the Patient Service Margin Review Committee, and even if you don't know what it's called at your hospital, it exists because it looks at how much each surgeon costs the hospital per operation, looks at your hardware, if you're implanting hardware, what kind of disposables you use with each operation, and how much each operation costs, basically based on as compared to what is billed. So I was, when I started as surgeon-in-chief in July of 2020, asked to participate in the Patient Service Margin Committee, and I said, sure, I have no idea what that is, but sure. So on the call is the CFO of the hospital, and multiple people from the data analytics team, and then the CEO of the hospital calls in from time to time. So we were reviewing one day the cost of spine surgeries by spine surgeon. And, this one costs this tens of thousands of dollars, and this one costs another $10,000 or whatever. But they noticed that this one category of spine surgery, of spine surgeons, had very low operative costs. And, they were trying to drill down on what is that. And I looked at and I said, hey, can you pull up on the spreadsheet who the surgeons are? Well, it turns out it's our neurosurgeons. And the way our hospital is set up, we have a very strong spine surgery program that's a combo of neurosurgery and orthopedic surgery. But said neurosurgeons do not do any spine surgery, no instrumentation at all. They do tethered cords, though. And that was classified as spine surgery. And so I said, well, that was but it would have taken them, months of meeting with the neurosurgeons to figure that out. And being a physician who sees this from day to day, it was an easy fix, I guess, or demonstration of the understanding of the processes. So as far as a new surgeon-in-chief, I have tried to establish myself as a resource in the hospital. I have standing meetings with all of the stakeholders in the hospital, so that I have a meeting with the CNO, the CEO, once a month, with the chief medical officer. A lot of what he wanted me to do was offload any complaints he had about surgeons, so that I could be the person to sit down in the operating room lounge and have those conversations if people were not sort of falling in line with what they needed to do. I think it's important as you sort of navigate through the hospital administration system to hold confidences, because people tell you things that you may not even want to know, but if you turn around and then repeat that to someone else, nobody's going to tell you anything ever again. So, but I also think it's important, if there are like misbehaving surgeons or whatever, to sit down and just go straight to the source and say, hey, what happened? Is it frustration at home, your life? Are you burnt out? What are the issues? Was it really a process issue in the operating room that day? And again, hold those confidences that you get, but it really helps you to understand sort of what's going on and where the process opportunities are within the hospital. Another thing that I have found important is to listen to the naysayers. So I have one partner who will be contrary just to be contrary, and is talking all the time, and most people tune him out. However, I listen very carefully to what he has to say, because he may not be alone in his concerns. He also comes up with really creative solutions to things that I haven't even thought about. And so I think that getting that perspective creates buy-in amongst your sort of most challenging people to deal with. And then finally, and I'll repeat this, is just going to the source for context of what's going on. If there are problems, going straight to the person that's involved rather than sort of tiptoeing around the issue is usually a very easy way to address a problem. So, thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Our next speaker is a man I've known for decades, Dr. Kevin Lally, from Houston, Texas, chair and professor of pediatric surgery and chairman of the Department of Pediatric Surgery and surgeon-in-chief of the Children's Hospital. He was the guy who told me, when you leave the OR in your scrubs, put on your white coat when you go to that meeting with the administrators, because they need to know you're the doctor and they're the administrator. And I have done that consistently for the last 20 years, ever since you told me that. So this is a guy who will give you a lot of insight in how to succeed in healthcare administration.
Thanks, Duncan. That wasn't me. So Houston is an odd city in so many ways, and but it was actually Michael DeBakey who started the whole thing of wearing scrubs, and everybody in Houston does. However, I actually do think something along those lines is very important, and I'll circle back to my personal journey. But we're surgeons. We bring something very different to the table when we deal with administrators, and I make it very, very clear in just what I'm wearing to the meeting, where my position is on things. And I am enormously grateful to say I'm no longer taking night call. However, that's only about 2 years into it. And we're the only people who know what goes on at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. And when you're in a meeting with an administrator relaying how some piece of equipment broke, some crappy nurse was available, people didn't know how things were going, there was an enormous delay in getting to the operating room. Now, I may be the only hospital that has that experience, but you could imagine somebody else does. And it's a very powerful part of the meeting when it's like, yeah, it was last Saturday, and I was taking care of this kid, and this was going on. So you really do bring a lot to the table. Personal background, just to understand, I think there's a couple of issues here that are important. One, I went to the Air Force Academy, and that's 4 years of leadership training. So I never did any other leadership training because when I was 17, I was literally inoculated into leadership training. And my early career was 4 years in the Air Force when I finished my fellowship, which was also a very dive into leadership. I mean, within a year, I'm the vice chair of the department. When we got deployed during Desert Storm, I was over 44 surgeons, and I was 31 years old. So that kind of moved fairly quickly. The other thing, though, is I did move into some administrative role that I personally found enormously useful. Was they did put on a certificate degree in business administration at UT, and I took that. And then speaking some of the language with the administrator, I don't think you personally need to get an MBA, personal opinion, but understanding what a SWOT analysis is and some stuff about budget stuff is very useful. Most of us don't train to do that. We have two different organizations, and everybody's a little bit different. So my children's hospital is about a 330-bed hospital. It's part of a 12-hospital system throughout metropolitan Houston. So we're called a hospital within a hospital. We occupy about 33%, about a third of our Texas Medical Center campus for our system. Nonprofit organization, completely separate from the medical school. And then the University of Texas Medical School is one of multiple schools as part of the UT system. Separate entity, obviously also non-for-profit. Two different entities altogether, so there's two different roles, and then the meshing becomes a challenge. On the hospital side, the surgeon-in-chief role, I've been there long, so we went from 120 now, whatever, 330 beds. So I've grown with the hospital, kind of created the role. And aligning funding is important. And if you look at the Surgeons-in-Chief organization, and some people were actually here as we founded that years back, it's important to gain support for those roles. And as we negotiated a restructure and things about, 15 years ago now, I said that the Surgeon-in-Chief needed 50% of their salary funded by the hospital. And that remains today. And we were also negotiating for the role of physician-in-chief, and I was very clear that the 50% number is going to be different from the surgeon. And I said, That's just what the market is, and so the surgeon needs to be paid for their time. Otherwise, it makes no sense at all for you personally. So we created that role. The other thing that I looked around where other people have done is we're developing the role. I think it's very important. You need to have a seat at the table. So I meet with the CEO, I don't know, every once a week, maybe every other week. I meet the COO, the CNO, but I made sure that role was a permanent position on the Children's Hospital Board. And I think that's important because you just connect with people and you be able to talk to people. So I think that's important. Now, the university is a little bit different, right? So all of the specialists who work at our hospital are employed by the University of Texas, myself included. So funds flow from the hospital. It's a whole other conversation over drinks about funds flow from the hospital, believe me. Actually, it's more than one drink. So what happened in the early 2000s, things were really falling apart. We were structured very traditionally, but a traditional academic department, when you column base a pediatric surgeon in a heavily underfunded environment, which Texas is and Houston definitely is, that's a losing proposition, a surgeon. Every surgeon is going to column out in the negative, and so if you're a department chair, your interest in adding negative is going to be pretty low. And so you have all these surgeons, and then you have each of these departments negotiating with the hospital, and there's no alignment of the specialists with the hospital. So we began losing a fair number of people. And it really got to the point where it was just chaos and everything was completely falling apart. And we had talked about how we could move forward. And parenthetically, I tell people it's only a few times I ever looked for jobs, and that was the one time I actually looked for a job during that time period. Things were pretty bad. Anyway, we talked about how to restructure, and there's models around this that many hospitals have that the surgeons are employed. They're either in a nonprofit organization or organized differently. But I didn't want to move the surgeons into a parallel nonprofit 501. I just wasn't interested in that. So the only way you do that in a university, the way universities think, is you create a separate department. And I felt that was important because my interface then was with the school leadership, right? Prior to then, the children's surgeon's voice to the school was through the different departments. It was kind of a second-tier voice. And then that puts me at the same level of all the other chairs. And I think that was very important. So we organized that, grew that program, and it's evolved a little bit, but that's still largely speaking the structure. So then they create the employment model in the university, and the physicians are university appointed to the Department of Pediatric Surgery, joint appointments to the other departments, but it creates an alignment of time. And so since then, we've grown a lot, and so has the hospital. And fortunately, Houston grows, so it's easy to do that. But I think that's the right structure to kind of move forward, and we'll have time for Q&A.
Thank you, Kevin. And Kevin's also going to speak a little later about how to do both an administrative role and a research role, and to actually continue to produce useful information for us on the treatment of diaphragmatic hernia. Denny Lunn is our next speaker. He is the endowed professor of pediatric clinical affairs at Stanford and has even a somewhat different administrative role. He's chief medical officer of the Lucile Packard Children's Hospital at Stanford University and the associate dean of the faculty for maternal and children's health. He's going to give us insights of a senior surgeon in a myriad of roles outside the operating room, including CMO, associate dean, interim president, and CEO, just to name a few. And I've asked him specifically also to comment about how, doing all that, you maintain your credibility as a pediatric surgeon among your colleagues while doing all of that.
Thanks, Duncan. A better title for my talk is What to Do If You Can't Hold a Job. My career in administration it really is quite similar to Stephanie's. In 1990, when I finished my fellowship at Boston Children's Hospital, Dr. Hendren called me to the office and said, Dan, we want you to stay on the faculty. I said, thanks, Dr. Hendren, I'm very honored. He said, I need you to start a trauma program. I said, okay, how do I do that? He said, well, you can figure it out. Those were the early days of Level 1 trauma centers. There were very few children's Level 1 children's trauma centers. And as you might imagine, Boston was a bit of a shark tank with regards to trauma centers. There was actually a joint trauma center between the Brigham and the Beth Israel Hospital. Try to figure that one out. But what it did do for me is it kind of forced me to learn what leadership is, which is trying to get a group of people to work together to achieve a common goal that may not be in their direct best interests. And so I took that on very, very seriously, and we went through the process. We had our first site visit, which we failed, and corrected all the deficiencies, and then came back and had another site visit and passed that, and Boston's been re-verified as a Level 1 trauma center ever since. But what that taught me is that as an individual pediatric surgeon, you can make your institution better. And that has always been my goal, is to make my children's hospital better. And I'm really a strong apologist for children's hospitals as the absolute best way to take care of the sickest kids. So when I moved on to Wisconsin in 1999, I actually had my aha moment. And that is when I went there, I was going to a major research university that had a superb transplant program, a superb cancer center, kind of all of the building blocks that you needed for a superb children's hospital, and they had a ward within the hospital. So part of my mission when I went there and my plan was to actually build a children's hospital. And I tell you, people got sick of me because I could never talk to anybody about anything other than how are we going to build this children's hospital? How are we going to build this children's hospital? And in fact, I got there in 1999. In 2007, we opened the American Family Children's Hospital. I could tell you the cost of raw steel during that project. during that project, I was so involved in every aspect of that project. One of the real frustrating things was raising the money. We needed $100 million to get this project going, and raising $100 million in a community of 240,000 people is like, forget it. But, they were able to raise $125 million to renovate the football stadium at the University of Wisconsin at the same time, like that. So it's just, but again, I got to learn how to talk to all kinds of people from all kinds of disciplines to achieve a common goal, which ultimately was kind of the best thing that I ever did in my career. Unlike Kevin, I did not go out and get an MBA, and I actually don't think you need to go out and get an MBA. Fortunately, I married an MBA, and she's standing in the back of the room there making sure I don't say anything stupid. But I did go out and very intentionally get leadership training. I did the Brandeis Fellowship. I did the leadership training course at the American College of Surgeons. I did a leadership training course at the University of Wisconsin. And I would strongly recommend that if you're interested in administrative leadership, that you actually get some of that skill set, so that even though you're wearing a white coat when you walk into the room, and I recommend that as well, you can tell them what EBITDA is, or contribution to margin is all about, because that's the language that the bean counters talk and the hospital administrators talk. From a mentorship perspective, I've had 3. Research mentor was Judah Folkman. Clinical mentor was Hardy Hendren. But my administrative mentor was Bing Rickers, and you guys probably don't know who Bing Rickers was, but Bing was the editor of the Annals of Surgery for many, many years, general hepatobiliary surgeon, and really a phenomenal leader and role model as an administrative leader. And he basically taught me what all good leaders know, and that is, identify who your horses are, ride them, and get out of the way, let them go. And I think, with what we were able to accomplish at Wisconsin, it was really because Bing backed me, but let me do my thing. Since then, I've transitioned more to practice management and other kinds of leadership, physician leadership. The move to Phoenix Children's Hospital for me as executive vice president of Phoenix Children's Hospital was actually a tremendous learning experience because I learned more about the private practice of medicine during that period of time because I'd always been in academics. So when Stanford came looking for somebody who knew about both, because they were starting a community foundation as well as their faculty practice plan, I kind of had the tickets that they were looking for. So that was incredibly beneficial. And the last thing I want to say very, very briefly is pediatric surgeons are well positioned to be leaders in organizations because we take care of all aspects of patients. ECMO doesn't scare us, trauma doesn't scare us, major liver resections don't scare us, taking care of the sick doesn't scare us. And so we have credibility in each of those areas. So I think pediatric surgeons are really uniquely positioned to be leaders and to move into not only a hospital but medical school leadership as administrators and use your experience to lead others. So thanks.
Thank you, Denny. Our next speaker is Bob Sawin, who I have also known for many, many years. And he was formerly professor of surgery at the University of Washington and chief of general and thoracic surgery at the Children's Hospital in Seattle, as well as surgeon-in-chief of the Seattle Children's Hospital, senior VP and chief surgical officer of the Seattle Children's Hospital, but has actually transitioned to a somewhat different career now and is an executive coach through a firm called Marquis Leadership. And I've asked him to speak about his more recent experiences and how they've played into additional non-clinical administrative duties.
Thanks, Duncan. Yeah, it's tough going at the end of a group like this because a lot of the major points have been made, but I was going to just tell you my brief story and then highlight a couple of lessons that I learned along the way, things that in retrospect I wish I'd learned earlier or done better. I trained at Seattle Children's, and Dave Tapper was my mentor in all regards, research, clinical, and administrative. After 6 years on faculty, David asked me to lead the division of general and thoracic surgery. And then, unfortunately, as many of you know, Dave became critically ill in 1999. And I was asked to fill in as the acting surgeon-in-chief at that point. And we could certainly spend time, perhaps in the discussion, asking about the challenges of being an interim or an acting chief. They are considerable. But we had an external, David ultimately gave up his role, and we had an external search, and the first round of candidates came through, and I was excluded, which caused a lot of hurt feelings, but also gave me an opportunity to sort of take stock of how important is this to me, and what are the skills that I might have or might be lacking. Fortunately, the three external candidates who were offered the job turned them down, and yours truly got it sort of by default. And a couple of the lessons that I've learned along the way that weren't obvious to me. I thought, and I still to this day hear colleagues say this, that leadership is intuitive. I wanted to highlight what Denny said. There may be some intuition, there may be some innate skill, but there's a lot that we can learn about leadership and need to learn about leadership. And I think leadership in the 21st century is different than it was in the 20th century as well. And one of the things that I pretty quickly learned when I was in the acting role, and I went to the first hospital steering committee, and I had this bias when I went to the meeting that those guys downstairs, it was mostly guys, don't get it. They don't understand what's going on. I went to my first hospital steering committee meeting and realized, whoa, they do get it. They just don't get everything. And several people have spoken to the importance of and the credibility and the gravitas that we have as surgeons to be able to educate them about some of the things that they don't fully understand. But don't presume for a minute that it should be a we or they or we versus they kind of a thing. And in fact, I viewed my role as Surgeon-in-Chief as challenging as I think surgical researchers find themselves in that same position where sometimes you're not particularly respected by those who are devoted researchers, and sometimes some of your surgical colleagues may look at you skeptically because you're a surgical researcher. But those people who are able to live in that space and communicate with both of those communities, if you will, are incredibly valuable, because that's how surgical research advances surgical care, for example. So in the hospital setting, being able to understand administrators and to be able to communicate with them effectively is imperative. And it has to go beyond just identifying the problems. You have to be part of the solution. I do want to mention that for me, one of the major, I hope, improvements in my performance was that I was offered an executive coach myself. I at first reacted when the chief medical officer said, we want you to work with an executive coach. I thought, am I screwing up? What's going on? And I quickly learned that almost all the other executives in the hospital were working with coaches. And I talked to people in the business world, and they said, yeah, every executive at our organization has an executive coach. So I begrudgingly started working with this coach, and it was, for me, a major transformation in how I viewed my role. So we could talk at length about that, but that's, I found so much value in that as I approached the end of my career, I thought maybe I could do this and bring to that coaching world some knowledge of clinical medicine, in particular surgery. So many of my clients now are surgeons or surgical leaders, so I hopefully am adding some value there. The one other thing I wanted to mention is I had a conversation with Carlos Pellegrini, who is the chair of the Department of Surgery, and I think most everybody knows Carlos. He's had leadership roles in virtually every surgical organization. Carlos asked me at one point about a structural multidisciplinary program and reporting relationships, and my response was that I didn't like the way this was being proposed because there wasn't a clear identified leader. And Carlos just looked at me and he said, he said, I think you're wrong. He said, I think the way medicine's going now, it's going to be all multidisciplinary, cross departments. And he said, you don't have to have authority to be an effective leader. You have to be an influencer. He said, influencers have lasting and enduring impact on an organization, whereas people who lead just by authority might have short-term success, but aren't as likely to have long-term success. So those are a few of the lessons that I found very valuable, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks, Bob. So Trey's going to pass the microphone around if people have questions. I was hoping to start out with Cindy. The beginning of your academic career or hospital career, I'm sure there was a small percentage of your time spent with administrative duties. Now it's probably much more. What's a reasonable beginning for someone in their first 5 years out of fellowship? And then what did you transition to now as Surgeon-in-Chief?
Do you mean financially or?
No, I just mean, like, what percentage of your time at the beginning when they asked you to be on the ICU committee or whatever, what percentage of your work month was spent doing administrative, non-clinical duties, and then how has that evolved?
So I think this is on.
Yeah, you have to just have it close to your face.
Yeah, thanks. Probably 10% or so initially, just being asked to be on the various committees in the hospital. And the one that I had referenced, the Central Line Associated Bloodstream Infection Committee, it's largely nurses within the hospital and the vascular access team. But they have a great focus on reducing CLABSIs in the hospital. a lot related to the dressings that are put on central lines. And as we're the ones actually putting the central lines in, we thought it was important to have a surgeon on that committee. And so that's been helpful. So just one example. My time now, I believe my work assignment is 20% administrative, and it's a little bit more than that with the program director, but just straight up for the surgeon in chief role is about 20%.
So surgeon in chief, about a 20% administrative role.
And talking to my colleagues, I think that's pretty low. So
Okay, low. And Kevin, what do you think?
In terms of the surgeon-in-chief percent effort, 20%
Yeah,
is really
and-
low. Yeah, I mean, that takes a hunk of time. I mean, there are several former surgeons-in-chief here, and between all the meetings and administrative stuff, 20% is going to be difficult to get all those jobs. And if it's funded at 20%, but they expect you to do 40%, which is probably the case, then you need to get the funding up to 40%.
Okay.
Harun Patel, Houston. Thank you very much, Duncan, for putting this together. Two questions. Follow up to that one. There's a perception when you do these health administration masters, MBAs, that you can't do surgeon and administrator equally well, and I'm curious. I mean, we're talking about certain percentages, but in our own mind, I'm talking about senior level administration. Can you be a good pediatric surgeon and a senior level administrator and do them equally well? So that's the first question. And then as an extension to that, in this whole work-life balance, all of this requires a lot more time. And these meetings seem to happen always, taking away from your family time. And so I'm just curious how the panel have dealt with that, what advice you have for upcoming surgeons who want to be involved in administration. And I'll just end with what we think. We're all legends in our own mind, and we think we're doing great with our own families. And I recently moved and had the luxury of packing things up. And as any self-respecting parent would do, you read your child's journal from when they were 12 years old. And for me, that was an eye-opener. What I thought was doing and providing and being a good parent and surgeon, very different perception when you talk to the people that are affected by these decisions. So I'm just curious how people handle them.
Yeah, great questions. Anyone want to start?
Well, yeah, I was trying to allude to that, the analogy with the surgical researcher. There is a tension when you're trying to be an active clinician and an effective administrator, but I really think it's imperative that someone is in that space. And I do think you can do both well. I think you have different credibility in the two audiences. One of my shortcomings was that I didn't always communicate effectively to the surgeons what the administrators were thinking. So you have to be a bridge between those two groups, if you will. You become the glue that's imperative for the institution, from my perspective.
Kevin, did you?
Yeah, one just personal thing. I don't use the term personally, work-life balance. I don't use those. I use the term life balance. I don't think that work should be in competition with the rest of your life. For me personally, it's an integral part of my life. Surgery has always been a critical component that defines me. I will put no value judgment on what other people decide where they want to allocate the percent times of their careers and lives, personal decisions, but it's life balance, and I think it is important you have life balance, though. You'd have to ask Pam. We're about to have our 39th anniversary. If it's worked out or not, I can't judge that. She might tell you no. The surgeon part is critical. The further you get into an organizational change, the less and less you're going to be able to operate. I don't know at what point that becomes a tipping point. My personal argument, on 250, 300 cases a year, I'm doing about just that number right now. But once you get below a certain point, surgery is a contact sport, and it's important that you stay proficient. But I think you absolutely can do both roles. If you're inefficient in the operating room, you're not going to survive.
Yeah, I think many young APSA members come up to me and say, if I'm invited to be on all these committees, that's 10% additional work. So instead of working 1.0 job, I'm now working 1.1 job. So how do you, in answer to Dr. Patel, how do you not, with each new administrative responsibility, have a giant job that you're now working 150% of the time that you had hoped to work?
There's Danny. He's had about 15 jobs.
Yeah, how do you do that?
Well, it helps to be a dinosaur because, back in the days, you just worked two FTEs worth of work. And you better have a very, very understanding spouse who's willing to support that. No, I think it's hard. It's not right. I've been through various different phases of my career where I was much more active in the operating room, but as I got a little bit older, I also developed some health issues that made me slow down in the operating room, and it became incredibly hard to stand and do a 14-hour cloacal reconstruction. But I do think you have to be in the OR to have that credibility. And actually, I am now to the age where I'm not operating in the operating room anymore, and a day does not pass when I question, am I still being effective as a physician leader amongst physicians? And when I get to the point where I feel that's not the case, then I will stop doing administration. But it's extremely hard to get it all done. Again, in Wisconsin, I was the division chair of general surgery, 35 surgeons. I was on the board of the foundation there. I was the surgeon in chief of the Children's Hospital. But as Kevin said, it's not work-life balance. That's your life, and if you're loving it, you do it.
Bob, did you want to say?
I just wondered if the other panelists shared the experience I did, which is that for those of you who are contemplating this, the problems that lingered, that went home with me, were always the administrative ones and not the clinical ones. The operating room and taking care of patients brought me great joy, and it was really a respite at times from the administrative headache. So I don't know if that's a shared experience among the leaders.
And any hints or tricks while you answer that about those administrative roadblocks where for whatever reason they just don't listen? And what do you do when you're in these various roles, either committees with a whole bunch of administrators or whatever, or surgeon in chief, and they ain't listening to you, the doctor?
We have open carry in Texas. I don't know what.
Go ahead, Cindy.
Well, I was just going to respond to Dr. Salin's comment. I think it's the clinical things that keep me up at night, because I know that a child's life is at stake. Now, there are a lot more children's lives at stake if the administrative issues aren't resolved, but it just, I figure that those are going to come to some resolution. But when I worry about a child that I've actually done something to, that keeps me up at night. So one other thing that I wanted to say is back to the keeping your surgical credibility. Dave Richardson, whom hopefully most of you know is the president of the American College of Surgeons, advised me early on, you have to be a surgeon first in order to maintain that credibility and operate, even if it's just a little bit, you still have to have that presence in the OR in order to maintain that credibility. So.
Does anyone want to take on the roadblock question? Anyone?
Yeah, so you're not going to win all the battles.
Okay.
Okay? You just got to assume that you're not going to win all the battles. And so then you got to figure out what are the important battles to fight. And in fact, one of the things you find out when you do a lot of administrative work is there are a lot of battles that aren't even worth fighting. People argue about the most incredible nonsense. I have an old adage that that I use often, and it always gets people's attention. Is if I can't hear it bleeding, it's not an emergency. And everything seems to be, everybody wants to make everything an emergency, and it's not the case. But when things are important, then you stand your ground. Open carry law. But when they're, sometimes you got to give ground because it just isn't important.
Stephanie.
I just wanted to add a quick statement about the work-life balance. and agree it is life balance. I'm coming from the perspective of someone who's younger. I have young children at home. So for those who are in my position, or I think more importantly, for those who are going to be mentoring people who are coming out of fellowship and trying to find this balance, I think a lot of what we have to remind people like me or younger people is that you have to have your own personal expectation of what you are okay with, and you have to be able to tune out other people's expectations. So, you know, especially for me where my kids happen to go to school, I'd say 90% of the moms stay at home. And my children are young, and they don't understand why mom does, I mean, they know why mom does what she does, but it's hard for them to understand, see other moms at school all the time, at the sporting game or handing out the prizes at the end of the race line, and their mom is not there. And then to hear what other people are saying. And then part of it is I have to teach my girls what it is that I do, because I want them to grow up to be strong women who can have their own careers. I have to be okay with, when I show up at these events, to let go of what I don't know about their school. I can't be the 100% PTA mom and the 100% surgeon. And so that's like an internal struggle, and I think that for a lot of young people coming out, have to let them know that that is okay, that you're not going to do these things great in both buckets in their perspectives. You're just going to have to do it well in your perspective, and then kind of help your family or your children understand, you know, why it is you do what you do.
Some people say you don't necessarily need an A+ and everything, but an A- is pretty damn good, you know. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah.
So one comment about life balance that we saw happen with the pandemic is Zoom creep into the evening hours. Now, I know a lot of us had evening meetings and things like that before the virtual environment was so prevalent. But as committee chairs, as leaders in the hospital, if you have the opportunity to schedule meetings during work hours, and I know as surgeons it's really difficult to get everybody on the same page, but that's why God invented doodle polls. So figuring out when everybody can be available during work hours is really going to help with home availability. And I'm pretty sure that attorneys, bankers, et cetera, are not having meetings every night of the week on Zoom. So
That's great
Duncan,
advice.
Duncan, I have a question.
Yes.
For the panel. So how many of you have dealt with or are dealing with tensions between the university and the hospital? And, and a lot of times the hospital is providing a lot of the financial support for the departments and the divisions, yet the university oftentimes is seen as the one that is leading that. And how do you, any tips on managing that? And secondly, how do you get your funding for your position allocated? Is it a reduction in your clinical expectations, or how is that done?
Well, we have enormous challenges. I don't think it's remotely unique. This is a 21st century problem with academic health centers and hospitals. But I always tell people to recognize within organizations that it's all under one giant umbrella, and maybe Denny can speak to that. The tensions are going to still exist. The clinical enterprise has its own drivers about cost efficiency and management that are still going to drive tensions between the clinical enterprise and the hospital or the university, independent of who owns one or both. So those tensions exist. They're just more visible because you don't have one dad or mom that says this is what we're going to do. But it's very, very, very challenging, and I would bet nobody has a clean and good answer to this because financing is getting more challenging, margins are getting tighter. Academic health centers have their own set of problems that they don't generate their own revenues. Anytime you embark on a research program, that is going to, by definition, lose money, and so it becomes an enormous tension. We manage that by delivering outstanding clinical care, and that to me has to be an undercurrent for the academic mission, outstanding clinical care. And then if we deliver that outstanding baseline of clinical care, that is enormously valuable to the hospital, and to me that's a starting point for conversations, but it is enormously challenging.
Yeah, Kevin, I think you're absolutely right. At Stanford, we have kind of a unique situation. Sounds like you get a little bit similar at Texas, and that is that the hospital does a physician revenue cycle. So all of the revenue that comes into the healthcare organization is managed by the hospital, and then through a funds flow process that I chair, unfortunately, we pass money to the medical school to pay the physicians. It makes a lot of sense, but if you actually sit down and think about it, it's the perfect model for moral hazard, because you can ask for anything you want because you don't pay for it. The hospital's going to pay for it, right? So then this sets up this kind of natural tension between the hospital and the physicians of, they won't give me what I ask for. And part of my leadership role as an associate dean and a CMO is to kind of straddle that and hopefully kind of manage those conversations. But as the margins of children's hospitals in particular get tighter and tighter, those conversations are getting harder to have, and especially in a place like Northern California, which is the most expensive place in the universe to live.
Can I follow up with you in particular when you were in Phoenix and you had a lot of private practitioners? How did that work into the mix?
Well, Phoenix, the physicians were all employed. Many of the physicians were employed by the hospital, and we didn't have as kind of strict an RVU based. I'm going to make an editorial comment here. I think RVUs are a tool of the devil, but we were able to kind of balance a lot of that by putting people on salaries plus bonuses there rather than strict productivity models. But however you build your compensation plans is going to have unintended consequences, and you need to be aware of what those are.
Great.
Well, I think we may have to end up because we're over time now, but I appreciate everyone coming. Thank you to all the panelists. Appreciate all your insights, and I'm sure they'll be willing to stick around if anyone has questions. Thank you.